Hello, my name's Emma Price and I work with artists, commission artists. So I do feel a slight imposter to this talk at the moment. However, saying that, it's really refreshing that the debates that you're having in the social sciences and about placemaking are the same conversations we're having within the arts. So how artists can affect change, can go into communities, talk about the environment and so forth. So I just wanted to say how refreshing it was to see that we're not on our own going in on a theoretical level, but also on a practical level, particularly artists in residencies who have a durational time in a community or indeed on a subject. So it was just to say that's really interesting and that we're not alone. And to ask a brief question, do you work with artists and have you worked with artists in your own particular fields? Thank you.
Okay, that's one question. I'll take two other comments or questions. Yeah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Gary Jones, retired from Newport University. How would the panel reconcile the political changes we're seeing right now with regard to food sustainability in particular, with the difficulties of interdisciplinary research and the complexities of research and implementing change in connection with that?
Just on the topic of theorizing, thinking about what Katarina said there, and I hadn't really thought about it in that respect, working in interdisciplinary teams, but not just necessarily towards policy or some sort of applied result, but working in an interdisciplinary team towards the creation of new theory. And I wonder if any of the three of you have had experience with that. My hunch is that that would really place you at the cutting edge of the research landscape.
I'm happy to lead off about the important question about art and engaging with artists. And the answer to the question is yes. And indeed, I often reflect that the work that I've done with visual artists has been among the most creative work that I've been involved in my professional career. And I'll point to a specific piece of work we did when I was based at Australian National University, and it was a collaboration between the National Centre for Epidemiology and the School of Art. And it was focused on what we call the contested landscapes of Western Sydney. So it was looking at urban development, urban expansion, urban sprawl, if you like, in Western Sydney, and the contest between housing as a form of land use with food growing, because that part of Sydney was the first food bowl in the nation, and that the value of working with artists was, I guess, twofold. Firstly, as a way as scientists, we initially briefed the artists, and then they made their artworks using a range of different media, and then exhibited it in the community. So it was a terrific way of engaging the community in the science, but through the arts. Because people have, if you like, often stopped listening when we put up these charts and tell the stories of the problems. It's not engaging people in their hearts, and they're thinking about it, but through the arts we can engage more emotionally with communities. And the other great thing about it was that the art then influenced the scientists, and so it was there was a feedback in terms of thinking and reflecting on their science and the way they approached it. So yeah, it's been of tremendous value. Yeah.
The comments on that or the other two questions?
Yeah, we haven't yet engaged with artists. However, we sort of accidentally did it. A colleague of ours who works in a not-for-profit organization that focuses on seed saving, out of a book project that we had last year, he wrote a poem called "The Fractured Food Systems Blues." And yeah, well, exactly. So it's being and it's spun off all these other interesting side projects, very small at this point. But what it's told us is this, as Tony's saying, it's a really great way of getting our messages out. That's much more accessible, and I think that that's something we're going to be doing more of. And I love the example that you gave. So that I think there's a lot of, we're just not quite there yet in the research that we've been doing, but that's something we would hope to do more of in the future. If I can address the question about food specifically, okay. And policy, I think that was the question you were asking, in the current policy environment. I can't speak to the current policy environment here because I don't really have any expertise in that. But although I think that there's lots of good policy pieces that can be brought together that can facilitate positive conversations around things. I know that one of the things that we found through the through the city region food systems work, and also through work that's happening in Canada, is that our sort of moving between scales and having things in place that help to address pressing issues is a way to help get food on the policy agenda as a way to solve problems. So a colleague of mine who used to be the manager for the Toronto Food Policy Council, which is a very grounded initiative in Toronto, used to say that he had a series of reports in his desk drawer that he could pull out. So if somebody was interested in waste or food insecurity or any of the different issues that link to food, he had a solution. And I think that as long as we're looking for solutions in terms of policy, it's a very practically driven way to do work, but that's one way of doing it. So looking for the ways that we can put things together in a solutions-based way, which I don't know if that answers your question somewhat.
My concern was the short-term scale of things with Brexit, I have in mind, frankly, with risk of food security, and the longer-term scale of implementing change to meet the demands of that political change.
Yeah.
That was behind my question. I didn't put it rather well in the first place.
No. Well, I kind of got where you were coming from. I just don't feel qualified to comment on it because it's not something that I've studied. But I think the more prepared people are to deal with situations and circumstances, and the more proactive you can be, and the more you can look at things as solutions oriented, then to the extent that whatever is going to unfold, because I mean there's so many question marks now. And also looking to other places that have good practices that would make sense as well is also a good way to address that, maybe.
Thank you.
And then the theory question. I think it's constant iteration in terms of the theory and the practice. And I'm not going to get this right. I think it's Eleanor Ostrom, but I'm not sure, said that good theory can always work in good theory can always work in practice. So I think that to the extent that we want to have theoretical and conceptualizations of what's happening in the world, it has to make sense in practice as well. So I think the iteration, because we're not creating theory just to have theory, right? It has to be grounded in what's happening in practice. So I think that the more that our research is doing that iterative thing, the more relevant the theory is, and also the more we can identify. The more we work together, the more we can identify these common points of intersection between the different disciplines, and that helps to develop more meta theories to the extent that we can have them. Maybe, I don't know, that's probably oversimplistic, but
I can also give some answers to those two questions, not about the political changes, but the other two, because when I worked in the Stockholm Resilience Center, and still they are working a lot with artists, so that's a constant kind of endeavor to both for themselves, I think, to visualize things, but also to engage with the larger communities. And these some of these exhibitions have traveled around, I don't know the whole world, but at least extensively as well around different countries. So that is indeed a way to communicate very much. But of course, if you have full-time communicators, that helps because they know how to deal with this as well and how to engage the researchers in a way that you explained about. And I also believe that working towards theory should be part of most larger, at least, projects where you both have some kind of practical, you're working towards solving some practical things, but also how to conceptually understand those practical things. That is theorizing. And the whole social ecological systems work is, of course, developing theory, because that wasn't there before. So, I mean, all of this, I think, has theoretical implications as well. But of course, in our daily work, we may not think so much about that. We are developing theory as we go along and investigate things together with new perspectives, because that is indeed theoretical development.
Excellent. Just let me pick up a little bit on this issue of political, because I think it is really quite important in the UK context, but not only there, in other parts of the world. Just come back from the US. You know, there's a lot of depression going on at the moment about short-termism and the geopolitical rise of nationalism and popular right movements across Europe. So we're in a world here which is changing, and I think it has changed over the lifetime of the Institute, actually. And we have to sort of confront that, I think. We have to sort of confront it and say, well, because what's part of this, of course, is a rubbishing of science in many cases. You know, we've had a Minister for the Environment who said we don't need any more experts. Yeah, we don't need any experts. So, we live in ideological times. We have to recognise that sort of point. So one of the things we're doing in the Institute, we're learning about perhaps a more practical way of communicating our work, not just relying on let's say, a linear relationship between scientists and policy makers, whatever they are, because they're not listening. There's an institutional deafness out there, right? Antagonism, even. So when we talk about these interfaces, I think we've got to be much more clever about and smart about how we do it. Maybe we emphasise more partnerships with civil society, with communicating the truth, right, which is under threat, to different levels and participative groups in these societies. So I think we're having a debate informally about what the most effective ways are of dealing with this. Clearly critique, but also shouldn't stop us communicating and having an impact, but we have to do it in a more nuanced and smart way, I think, given that some people, for the time being, are not going to listen. I think that's
fewer empty chairs at an event like this.
Well, yeah. Okay, so we'll take another round of points. Yeah, one over there.
All these ideas and theories are excellent, but how are they going to have an impact on the global market, private market, economics that's actually running the planet at the moment?
Okay, good. Yep.
As first speaker who talked about food waste problem, Colombo, I wondered, as an extension, there had been thought of using this massive food waste as a waste to energy, as one way of making good use of it. The second speaker, you talked about, yes, the advances in public health, but there seems to be new threats, not just plastics, which we've heard about, but Silicon Valley had these tech companies pumping out iPods, computers, etc., 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 and the heavy metals, the heavy chemicals, the toluene, the benzene, the lead, the copper cyanide, which they put into their storage, and then the solvents get through to the ground. So even got a Google building, they thought they cleared it away, despite there finally being actions, by the authorities. But it's too late. It's got through the ground. It's got through the Google building, and it seems to be the response of Silicon Valley just to chuck that all over to China. So, and there we're really having all the waste going into the rivers, and the groundwater and the rivers being polluted, but it doesn't seem to end there. It come home to roost because it's coming out through into the air and getting led back in the USA. So what can be done with regard to this very, very dangerous, massive threat, I would say, to public health? Otherwise, we're...
Okay, I think one more, yeah, over here.
Yes, Tony Capon mentioned a use of inappropriate measures, which, for example, with GDP. But of course, people feel safe in using measurements that people understand. How do we redefine measurements as appropriate to future sustainability and overcome the commitment that we have to existing measures and the infrastructure that has itself?
Okay, just one more.
I'm Esther from Malaysia. I just would like to ask for the third speaker, when you talk about the challenges in interdiscipline. So it's quite surprised me when you just talk about like the mutual understanding all these challenges, because I've been to others conference and meeting also among the academics, and one of the comments and the mutuals comments from the academic, they would talk about the challenges on finding data. So I'm not sure whether is it like here the data is quite open and then we can get it quite easily. So that is my questions would like to ask. Yeah.
Right, well, I'll go back to our increasingly tiring speakers, just as 4 sorts of issues there. 2 of them were linked together. One was economic orthodoxy and measurement, GDP.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll say a few things in response there. I mean, we're actually pretty close here to the University of Surrey, where Tim Jackson, of course, doing very important work on the idea of prosperity without growth. And I know that the Learned Society of Wales is planning an event in the coming months here in the UK on the concept of sustainable prosperity. You know, what would be different if we genuinely strived for sustainable prosperity, and I think that's a very important discussion for us to have, not just as academics, but with the wider community. The second point about pollution is enormously important and poorly understood. Indeed, quite recently there was another Lancet commission specifically on the health problems of global pollution. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting in relation to pollution, and particularly air pollution in Asia, is that it does seem that understanding air pollution, and for people of China having now real-time information about air pollution levels in Beijing and other cities, is leading to concern being raised with the government of China, and indeed the government officials are concerned as well. And so the improvements in information and technology are having a positive in that direction in terms of beginning to get action on that, at least an acknowledgement of the problem, and the need for action. Whether that action will be appropriate remains to be seen. But indeed, that seems to be driving the work to reduce carbon pollution, almost like an additional benefit of that. It's not direct in relation to carbon pollution. Always it's sometimes it's about those more immediate human health concerns in relation to direct pollution. But it's definitely an area where we need to pay much more attention the health consequences of pollution. And once these pollutants get into the broader water system and the groundwater, and obviously potentially getting into the food system as well. Concerns about fracking in that very short-term drive for fossil fuel energy, but what that might mean in the longer term in terms of our water system. So, you certainly point to very important questions there. One,
and then, the economic, basically moving the adoption from the USA to countries where they'll know there'll be less regulatory controls, and so it then gets out into it's put out directly into the rivers, and so the groundwater is directly affected, and so massive increase in cancers from the people concerned. So it's deliberate multinational company making use of.
Effectively exporting the
Yes.
pollution, but the consumption levels remain the same. So yeah, I mean, one important development is that China's beginning to refuse to take that waste back. You know, Australia, for example, was exporting a lot of its recycled waste to China for reprocessing, but effectively China's calling time on that, and then it puts the pressure back on high-income countries to reduce the amount of waste that they're producing. So, you know, hopefully that will have some positive impact in some contexts at least.
Yeah.
Any comments on the other question?
Yeah, why don't I answer the big question from the back? How are these ideas going to have an impact on the market globally? Of course, there are wishes, there are, you know, real situations, but I think, I mean, as a political scientist, I would like to see this in different levels of society, because things are happening a lot at the local level in many societies, driven by community concerns and visible problems that you have to deal with. And these movements are increasingly becoming connected, not least through social media and so on, by the global networks that we have now. So that's one layer. And then you have actually the market forces themselves, because we as consumers also behave in different ways, and being more informed, we, at least I'm dependent on which society, but I'm surprised as to Sweden. In Sweden, we are way beyond 25% of our consumption is now eco-labeled and so on. So it can happen very quickly, and nobody actually anticipated that. And the agriculture sector is now turning completely, you know, in a new direction, where they are thinking how to get a circular economy and so on. And this is also penetrating the political, the different venues for political discussion. I mean, both at the local government level, but also national level, and increasingly we all know that things are happening even at the international level, even if there are, you know, ups and downs with these things. But since the awareness is so much higher now than if you compare with Rachel Carson, Silent Spring or something, this is a change that cannot be stopped, I think, even though there will be, you know, going up and down. The financial, how the financial market works is another issue that I'm not an expert on, but I think that is something that we also need to bring into this sustainability discourse, and have increasingly economists and financial experts to think about how can this not only be measured in a different way in GDP, but also how can the financial markets work in a more sustainable manner, because they have caused many of the problems lately as well.
Alison, do you want to make any comments? You don't have to, but
just one quick one, also sort of a general one, is that I think, and not to be too Pollyanna-esque about this, because there's lots of problems with the United Nations, but I think the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are helping to change the conversation. Because what's happening at the global level, or at the national level, is every country in the world is having to go through what's called a voluntary national review process. And there's 4 of them starting in 2015 going to 2019, and every country has to stand up in front of the world at the United Nations and report on what they're doing and how they're moving towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the only way you can achieve your Sustainable Development Goals is by pushing it down to the local level. right? So I think that there's conversations happening because of this international initiative that's going to be, is going to be increasingly interesting in the future. So, and maybe I can talk to you afterwards about waste.
Okay, thank you. Hesitate to ask if there are any other questions. I think we've got so far. I mean, I think personally we're actually in a very interesting period at the moment, and I understand the let me put it with pessimism about the way things are going, which we read about in the right-wing press in this country at the moment. But I do agree that, in fact, we're on a process of transition. You see that happening, particularly in the energy sector. It's happening in the food sector. We're seeing rapid potential changes here, and it's both pull and push factors. The financial industry, our Bank of England director, Mark Carney, has been warning for quite a long time for the insurance industry and the financial sector. Get your act together, because you're going to be in a field of stranded assets. You're not going to be able to get it out of the ground. So if you're going to try and keep with these carbon-based assets, you're going to be in problems and you're going to lose money. And we're seeing sovereign wealth funds and all sorts of other examples of moving to ethical forms of investment, including universities, interestingly, and, after a struggle in some cases, hunger strikes and everything else. So that there are significant push factors which are actually moving global capitalism, in my view, to a new regime here. And then there's the pull factors, and this is around practices, sustainable practices and so on, which changing forms of consumption in energy, as you can see, but also in food and water. So I actually do believe that we're on a transition, notwithstanding political vicissitudes that we may have, which might, obviously kick us back, obviously. And so this is one of the interesting questions, is about to what extent it's a lot easier to knock things out than it is to build things, as we discovered this weekend, So I think, this is one of the challenges about rebuilding and also dealing with these potential kickbacks and negative circumstances in this field. So I'd just like to thank a very provocative and insightful, very experienced syntheses of work that three speakers have been doing, and for a stimulating session. So thank you very much.